What do we mean when we talk about civilization? What do we think of as marks of a civilized life? There is the city, the great metropolis, the center of the lives of millions, with its tall buildings, its spacious avenues, and public monuments, its streets and roads bursting with traffic, the transportation of its busy population. Urban life, in one form or another, seems to stand for civilization as we know it in the 20th century. Or there are the artifacts of modern, everyday life that we take for granted around us. These are the outward signs of civilized living, but some of the marks of civilization are less tangible. Music, drama, the visual arts, painting, sculpture, scholarship, learning, and accumulated knowledge passed on from generation to generation. Above all, civilization means an orderly way of life. The knowledge that you can go about your business without let or hindrance. People around the world can be secure in the knowledge there is a firm social and political organization, police, and a system of courts to uphold the law. A civil service to administrate, schools and universities to educate, a government to make the laws and levy the taxes to pay for the whole range of amenities we cannot do without. Looking back into the past, we can observe that behind modern civilization lie centuries of experience and experiment. The origins of civilization reach back over 6,000 years to the first urban settlements which arose in response to new conditions brought about by developments in agriculture. By around 5000 BC, peasant farming villages were well established over the whole of the Near East. But in southern Mesopotamia, the farmers faced a new challenge. The flat alluvial plain had immense possibilities for agriculture, but only if the waters of the great rivers flowing into the plain could be harnessed. To control the torrents of the great rivers, a system of dams and irrigation was necessary, and these could only be constructed and maintained by cooperative effort. Merely to keep the irrigation canals open required constant toil and vigilance, otherwise they would quickly silt up. And this required a high degree of organization, social organization, and ultimately, political organization. So, by 3000 BC, a number of towns or incipient cities were in existence in southern Mesopotamia. It was in these cities that Sumerian civilization, the earliest of all known civilizations, arose. Sumerian civilization was a civilization of city-states. In this flat countryside where there were no natural advantages, no city could exercise hegemony for long, and preeminence passed from one city to another before the whole region was unified by a conqueror from the north, Sargon, who founded a new capital for himself at Agade in 2371 BC. Sargon's empire soon extended beyond Mesopotamia to Elam in the Zagros Mountains in the southeast and all the way to Syria and the Mediterranean coast in the west. Sargon is the first semi-legendary figure of a mighty conqueror, whose successors reduced the importance of the old city-states by moving towards a more centralized government. The collapse of Sargon's empire, due both to the invasion of hillsmen and to internal strains, was followed by a renaissance of the Sumerian city-state system, in which Ur, with its mighty ziggurat, finally emerged as the dominant force. With its empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to Nineveh. But this in turn collapsed around 2000 BC under the pressure of new invaders, the Amorites, probably from eastern Syria. Among the great empires that they established was that of Hammurabi of Babylon in the 18th century BC. Overall, civilization was a response to the special needs and conditions of farming and cultivation, and all the first civilizations arose in the basins of the great river valleys. First of all in Mesopotamia, along the Tigris and the Euphrates. Along the Nile, Upper and Lower Egypt were united in 3100 BC by Menes, the first pharaoh of the first of 31 dynasties which ruled Egypt for over 2,500 years. Egypt, unlike Mesopotamia, remained essentially a rural country, with small market towns and few cities. So the leaders who emerged were rulers of extensive regions, rather than the heads of city-states. Thus, a single royal dynasty was able to rule the whole of the Nile Valley, from Aswan to the Mediterranean coast. The first civilization in the Indian subcontinent emerged about 2500 BC along the banks of the Indus, in modern-day Pakistan. There were two large cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, and 60 to 70 smaller towns with an empire covering an area of some 500,000 square miles. Like Mesopotamia, the Indus River civilization was a society of priests, merchants, and peasant farmers. There's no evidence in the course of its history of the emergence of kings and kingdoms. This imposing civilization lasted 1,000 years, until it vanished without trace about 1500 BC. Its existence was not rediscovered until 1925. In China, civilization first appeared along the Huanghe, or Yellow River. The small farming communities which cultivated the well-drained soil of the river terraces of the Huanghe and its tributaries were conquered in about 1700 BC by a relatively small group of invaders from the steppes of Inner Asia, the Shang. The Shang built impressive capital cities, with courts, royal functionaries, and craftsmen who produced bronze objects of superb delicacy. This ritual vessel is only 12 inches high. But the area of direct rule by the Shang was still small, and the unification of China still lay many centuries ahead. All the early civilizations in Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, and China shared many features in common. It was these characteristics which distinguished them from the earlier farming communities from which they sprang. It was these special qualities which are the marks of civilized living. The first and most obvious is the rise of the great cities, of urban centers. In Mesopotamia, some idea is given by the remains of Nippur, the main religious center of Sumer, now half covered by desert sand, with its temples, ziggurat, banking house, and extensive scribal district, where numerous Sumerian tablets have been found. But even this is dwarfed by the ruins of Babylon, which in the days of Nebuchadnezzar was a vast city with huge temples, monumental buildings, and the legendary hanging gardens. In India, the Indus cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, each covering some 6 or 7 square miles, were in some ways more impressive still. The walls, which can be seen today, represent centuries of successive rebuilding. Unlike most cities in the Near East, they were planned and laid out on a grid pattern, with an elaborate system of covered drains and wide main streets encompassing large blocks. The early cities were remarkable for their monumental buildings. This reconstruction of the ziggurat of Ur is an indication of the magnificence this temple once possessed. In Egypt, the greatest monuments are the pyramids, gigantic tombs which house the bodies of the king gods with all their finery awaiting afterlife. The earliest, that of King Zoser, is the massive step pyramid at Saqqara, built about 2650 BC. The greatest, that of the pharaoh Khufu, or Cheops, is at Giza and covers 13 acres. Rising to a height of 481 feet, it's built out of a series of huge stone blocks weighing an average of 2.5 tons each. Its construction required over 2 million of these large blocks. Monumental architecture was meant to impress, to mark the gulf dividing the ruling hierarchies from the common people, to stress the exalted, divine character of the rulers. The emergence of a sharp class differentiation is another basic characteristic of the earliest and of all subsequent civilizations. Wealth was concentrated in the hands of a new elite, priests at first, and then, as palaces began to rival temples, kings, soldiers, and bureaucrats, as shown vividly in the famous Standard of Ur, dating from about 2600 BC. Furthermore, the greater complexity of town life inevitably brought specialization. With civilization came craftsmen who produced artifacts of great beauty, no longer merely utilitarian, and jewelry of high artistic quality, like this Egyptian crown or diadem. The first class to be freed from other tasks were the priests, who conducted magical ceremonies to placate the gods, control the floods, and ensure good crops. Hence their preeminent place in early society. It was the priests, and in the case of Egypt the kings, who provided the original stimulus for the craftsmen, whose output to begin with was designed for the temples. But many of the crafts were dependent upon raw materials from outside. This led to the early appearance of professional merchants, who are specifically mentioned in the early temple accounts from Lagash about 2350 BC. In Mesopotamia and in India, the cities had sectors reserved for craftsmen and traders. One of the most decisive steps in the evolution of civilization was the development of writing. It was the priests of Sumer who, as custodians of the vast estates, had to manage the temple lands, and this necessitated the keeping of records and accounts, and so led to the invention of writing. The earliest writing, dating from before 3000 BC, was on clay tablets. The temple officials would take a lump of clay, as in this modern demonstration, flatten it, take a stiff reed and draw on the clay. The first writing was in the form of simplified pictures, drawings of a fish, a cow, or an arrow, known as pictographs. The original pictures were gradually reduced to conventional forms made with wedge-shaped strokes, known as cuneiform script. Thus, by 2000 BC, the representation of a cow, a fish, or an arrow had become a cuneiform symbol, in which the original picture was no longer recognizable. Writing originated purely as an instrument of administration, and the earliest written records are concerned entirely with business matters. But the value of writing for other purposes was quickly recognized, and before 2000 BC, it was in use for communication by means of letters and for recording many other forms of human activity, such as prayers, hymns, laws, historical records, and literary compositions. Soon, the idea of pictographic script spread from the Sumerian city-states via Iran to India and via Egypt to Minoan Crete, where hundreds of clay tablets in scripts known as Linear A and Linear B have been unearthed. The invention of writing was fundamental to the development of all later civilizations, and although writing has evolved into a whole range of different symbols, it's impossible today to imagine a society without the written word. Every child in a civilized society now has to learn to read and to write. Literacy is an essential requirement in becoming a full member of society.
M. It's letter M. I wonder if we can look at the words again now. Can you see any words there that begin with letter M?
No.
Can't have a good look.
But writing was not the only outstanding achievement of the Sumerian priests. Equally important was the measurement of time and the invention of the calendar. From the Sumerians, we derived the division of the minute into 60 seconds, the hour into 60 minutes, and the day into 24 hours. From Egypt, we inherit the basic calendar of 365 days in the year. All this required advanced mathematical skills which were needed for ordinary purposes of estate management as well. The Sumerians and the Babylonians standardized weights and measures and began to evolve the appropriate rules and formulae. By the time of Hammurabi, the temple clerks had drawn up multiplication tables, had learned to cope with fractions, and were able to solve quadratic equations. The foundations of modern mathematics and geometry had been laid. Europe at this stage lagged far behind. It was still a land of scattered farmers and dispersed villages. On the island of Crete, on the very edge of Europe, a first civilization was established by about 2000 BC. But this civilization, called Minoan, after Minos, the legendary king of Knossos, grew up on the fringes of the early Near Eastern civilizations and was more associated with the East than a remote ancestor of later European civilization. The first civilization in the Americas came much later, dating from 1000 BC. The American Indians remained isolated from their contemporaries in the Old World, and the first civilizations of Mesoamerica and the Central Andes owe nothing to ideas introduced from outside. All in all, the years from 3000 to 2000 BC constitute a decisive turning point in human history. The growth of the first great cities with monumental architecture marks the opening of a new era. But civilization is not measured simply by the size of cities and the splendor of their monuments. It was one of the periods of great advance. Writing, mathematics, the calendar, all were witnesses to a sudden burst of creativity. In addition, there is the ox-drawn plow, widely used in Mesopotamia and Egypt by 3000 BC, and soon spreading to India and China. The wheel, and with the wheel the cart. The mastery of the complex chemical processes involved in metallurgy. All these were achievements which would never be lost. But they were not achieved without cost. The great advance of civilization benefited the few far more than it benefited the many. City-states and empires brought political dependence and the rise of ruling oligarchies. Democracy, as we know it, if by democracy we mean government by the people and for the people, was unknown, even as an ideal, until the rise of the Greek cities in the 5th century BC. This was the price paid for the achievements, the great dichotomy which lies at the heart of civilization then and now. It's part of the inheritance we're still grappling with today. And when we look back to the origins of civilization, we should never forget the human cost.